You know, at the very height of the Cold War, you'd think the fate of the world rested with presidents in Washington or Moscow, but it didn't. It actually came down to one single impossible decision made by one man, deep beneath the ocean, in a situation that is, well, it's almost impossible to imagine. This is the story of how close we all came, and the man who pulled us back from the edge. Imagine hearing these words. "We're going to die, but we will sink them all." Those were the frantic words of a Soviet submarine captain, Valentin Savitsky. He was absolutely convinced that World War III had already begun, and he was moments away from making a choice that would have not only vaporized the American fleet above him, but almost certainly triggered a global nuclear war. So, let's set the scene. The date is October 27th, 1962, what many historians say was the single most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're on board the Soviet submarine B-59. It's cornered, it's totally isolated, and it's being hunted by a whole fleet of American warships right in the middle of the Sargasso Sea, not far from Cuba. Now, the conditions inside the submarine were, and I'm not exaggerating, a literal hell. The temperature was soaring past 50 degrees Celsius. That's over 122 Fahrenheit. The air was getting thick with carbon dioxide, making it hard to think straight. Their batteries were dying. They hadn't heard a single word from Moscow in days. And all they could hear were the constant explosions of what the Americans called practice depth charges, which to the crew sounded an awful lot like a real attack. So in the middle of all this chaos, Captain Savitsky gives the order, prepare and launch their special weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo. The political officer on board, Ivan Maslenikov, he agrees. Now, according to Soviet protocol, that should have been it. 2 officers agree, you launch. But as luck would have it, on this one submarine, there was a third man whose permission was needed. And his decision was the only thing standing between us and total Armageddon. Okay, so how on earth did it come to this? I mean, to really understand the pressure cooker environment inside that sub, we have to rewind a little and look at why they were even there, and more importantly, what they were carrying. Well, for starters, this whole mission, codename Operation Annatter, was fundamentally flawed from the very beginning. You see, these Foxtrot-class submarines, they were built for the freezing cold of the Arctic. Their cooling systems, their ventilation, none of it was designed for the tropical heat of the Caribbean. So, of course, the systems were completely overwhelmed, which is exactly why the conditions inside became so unbearable. And here's the real kicker, the secret that the Americans had no clue about. Each of these submarines was armed with a T-5 nuclear torpedo. This was their special weapon, designed to do one thing, take out an entire aircraft carrier battle group with a single blast. And its yield? Around 15 kilotons, which is just about the same power as the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. All right, so let's get back to the men with the final say. Vasili Arkhipov. It turns out he was uniquely and tragically prepared for this exact moment, because of a past catastrophe that taught him the true, horrific cost of a nuclear incident. See, Vasili Arkhipov wasn't just any officer. He was the flotilla chief of staff, basically the commodore for the whole submarine brigade. Because of his senior position, and because he was on the flagship B-59, the rules were different. A nuclear launch required the consent of 3 senior officers, not just 2. He held the veto power. And you have to understand, just 1 year before all this, Arkhipov had lived through an absolute nightmare. He was an officer on the K-19 submarine when it suffered a catastrophic reactor coolant leak, nearly causing a meltdown. He watched firsthand the horrific effects of acute radiation poisoning as his crewmates sacrificed their lives to stop a disaster. That experience gave him this visceral, gut-level understanding of nuclear consequences that his colleagues in that room just didn't have. Which brings us right back to that sweltering, claustrophobic command room on the B-59. The captain has given the order. The political officer has agreed. The fate of the world is hanging by a thread, and the world doesn't even know it. And this is the moment. Despite the captain's fury, despite the immense pressure of the situation, Vasili Arkhipov refused to give his consent. He calmly stood his ground and just said no. But it wasn't just a simple no. He actively de-escalated the whole crisis. He argued, logically, that the Americans were using signaling charges. They were trying to talk, not sink them. Then, in this bizarre moment of luck, a signaling officer actually blocked the stairway to the conning tower, which bought Arkhipov just a few precious seconds to talk the captain down. And he used that time to persuade Savitsky that the only sane, rational move was to surface and find out what was really going on up there. So the B-59 surfaced. Nuclear war was averted. But for Arkhipov and his crew, the story was, well, it was far from over. And for decades, the rest of the world had absolutely no idea how close it had just come to total annihilation. Because when they finally returned to the Soviet Union, they weren't celebrated as heroes. Not at all. They were treated like failures. Their superiors were furious that they had been forced to surface by the Americans, seeing it as this huge moment of national disgrace.
I mean, the hostility was just unbelievable. One of their own admirals, completely oblivious to the fact that these men had just saved the world, actually told them to their faces that it would have been better if they just died at sea rather than be discovered.
And get this, the real story stayed a secret for 40 years. It wasn't until a conference in 2002 that former Soviet officers finally revealed that the submarines had been carrying nuclear torpedoes. And it was there that Thomas Blanton, the director of the National Security Archive, first called Arkhipov what he was, the man who saved the world. And that one revelation just completely flipped the script on his legacy. For decades, within Soviet naval circles, he was just some officer on a failed mission. But now, history rightfully remembers him as the unsung hero whose cool head and moral courage won out under the most extreme pressure you can possibly imagine. The story of Vasili Arkhipov and the B-59 really leaves us with this incredible, powerful question. In a world full of complex technology and automated weapons, we build all these systems to keep us safe. But on October 27, 1962, the system failed, and our ultimate safeguard turned out to be the judgment, the experience, and the simple humanity of one person.